Sometimes the person the whole world condemns is the only one who never stopped telling the truth. The first camera flash exploded before the courthouse doors even opened, and within seconds dozens more followed, turning the cold Manhattan morning into a storm of white light. Reporters crowded against metal barricades, microphones stretched into the air, each one eager to capture the face of the woman America had already judged. Some whispered her name with pity, most with contempt, and many had already decided she belonged behind bars forever. Amara Brooks walked forward with measured steps, her wrists free but her future seemingly locked away. She wore a simple charcoal coat over a modest navy sweater, her tightly curled black hair resting naturally around her face. She did not lower her eyes. She did not search for sympathy. Her calm expression carried a quiet dignity that somehow unsettled everyone watching. She looked less like the terrifying criminal described across television screens, and more like an ordinary woman who had somehow wandered into the center of a nightmare she could not explain. As courthouse security guided her toward the entrance, another wave of shouted accusations echoed across the plaza. Every headline had already declared her guilty of murdering Daniel Whitmore, a wealthy real estate developer whose influence reached from New York boardrooms to Washington fundraisers. The evidence presented to the public seemed overwhelming, and nearly every news station repeated the same story without hesitation. Yet before Amara could disappear behind the courthouse doors, something happened that no reporter had expected. A black luxury sedan rolled quietly to the curb, drawing curious glances from everyone nearby. When the rear door opened, Jonathan Hayes stepped onto the sidewalk wearing a perfectly tailored navy overcoat over an expensive business suit. At 38 years old, he had become one of the youngest billionaires in America, known for transforming a struggling technology company into a global empire worth billions of dollars. Investors trusted his judgment. Politicians sought his support. Business magazines praised his discipline and vision. Yet, at that moment, none of those achievements mattered. Without speaking to anyone, Jonathan walked directly through the sea of cameras until he reached Amara. Security officers instinctively moved closer, uncertain whether to intervene, while reporters shouted questions from every direction. Jonathan ignored every voice around him. Instead, he removed his leather gloves, looked directly into Amara's tired eyes, and quietly said, "You won't walk into that courtroom alone." The entire plaza fell into stunned silence for only a heartbeat before chaos erupted once again. Journalists demanded explanations. Financial analysts watching live television immediately questioned whether Jonathan Hayes had destroyed his own reputation in a single reckless decision. Social media erupted within minutes. Some called him courageous. Others accused him of defending a murderer. Across Wall Street, investors watched stock prices begin to slide before the opening bell even rang. Inside the courthouse, attorneys exchanged confused glances because no one had expected one of America's most respected billionaires to publicly stand beside the woman every headline condemned. Amara herself looked equally surprised. She studied Jonathan's face carefully, searching for recognition, but she had never met him before. At least she believed she hadn't. Jonathan returned her gaze with a quiet certainty that even he struggled to explain. Something deep inside him refused to believe the woman standing beside him was capable of the crime everyone described. He had reviewed the public evidence the previous night, yet every instinct he had spent a lifetime trusting insisted that an important piece of the story had been hidden. As the courthouse doors slowly opened and the crowd surged forward once more, Jonathan made a decision that would threaten everything he had spent decades building, never imagining that the greatest secret waiting inside this trial was not about the murder at all, but about a forgotten moment from years earlier that had quietly connected their lives long before either of them realized it. Jonathan Hayes had built his entire career by trusting patterns that other people overlooked. Numbers rarely lied, but people often repeated convenient stories until they sounded like facts. As the courthouse elevators carried him and his legal team toward a quiet conference room, the image of Amara Brooks refusing to lower her head remained fixed in his mind. Every public interview described her as calculating and dangerous, yet nothing about the woman he had just met matched the portrait dominating every television network. Her eyes held exhaustion, not hatred. Her voice had remained steady despite the storm surrounding her. Most of all, She had shown no interest in asking him for help. That alone challenged every assumption the media had created. While attorneys prepared for the preliminary hearing, Jonathan asked his chief investigator, Michael Carter, to bring him every available record connected to Amara's life instead of focusing only on the criminal case. Michael hesitated. He reminded Jonathan that every major law firm in New York had already concluded the evidence looked convincing. Jonathan quietly answered, "Then I do not need another opinion about the evidence. I need to know who she was before any of this happened." By late afternoon, files began arriving one after another. Employment records showed that Amara had spent nearly 7 years as a registered nurse before leaving the hospital to care for underserved neighborhoods through a non-profit health outreach program. Former co-workers consistently described her as dependable, patient, and unusually calm during difficult situations. Community leaders praised her for organizing free health screenings, visiting elderly residents who lived alone, and mentoring young nursing students. Financial records painted an equally ordinary picture. There were no hidden luxury purchases, no unexplained income, and no signs of sudden wealth. Instead, Jonathan found years of modest paychecks, regular charitable donations, and monthly support sent to her aging grandmother in Georgia. None of it resembled the profile of someone driven by greed. The deeper Jonathan looked, the more uncomfortable he became with the simple narrative presented to the public. Later that evening, he visited the small nonprofit clinic where Amara had volunteered until only weeks before her arrest. The building stood on a quiet Brooklyn street between a neighborhood pharmacy and a family-owned grocery store. Inside, shelves were neatly stocked with donated medical supplies, handwritten thank you cards covered one bulletin board, and volunteers quietly prepared care packages for local families. An elderly receptionist smiled sadly when Jonathan introduced himself. She recognized Amara's name immediately. "She never left before making sure everyone else had what they needed," the woman said softly. "Sometimes we had to remind her to eat lunch." Another volunteer pointed toward a framed photograph showing Amara surrounded by children during a community wellness fair. Her smile in the picture was genuine, bright, and completely different from the guarded expression Jonathan had seen outside the courthouse. He studied the photograph for several silent moments before something unusual caught his attention. Hanging from Amara's wrist was a narrow braided leather bracelet with a small silver clasp. A strange feeling settled over him. He could not explain why the bracelet seemed familiar, but the image awakened a faint memory buried somewhere beyond reach. It was not a complete recollection, only the uncomfortable sensation that he had seen it years ago under circumstances he could no longer clearly remember. As Jonathan left the clinic and stepped into the cool evening air, Manhattan's skyline shimmered across the East River while countless office lights illuminated the city. He slipped a copy of the photograph into his briefcase, convinced that it represented nothing more than another piece of background information. He had no idea that the ordinary bracelet in that forgotten photograph was the first thread leading toward a truth that had quietly connected his own past with Amara's long before either of them realized their lives had already crossed. The following morning, Jonathan arrived at his headquarters before sunrise, but instead of reviewing merger proposals or quarterly forecasts, he spread every document connected to Amara Brooks across the long walnut conference table in his private office. The city outside slowly awakened beneath a gray winter sky while fresh coffee cooled beside stacks of court filings, employment records, and photographs gathered by Michael Carter overnight. The official investigation appeared remarkably straightforward. According to prosecutors, every important detail pointed toward Amara. Her fingerprints had been found in places investigators considered significant. Security cameras placed her near Daniel Whitmore's office on the evening in question, and a timeline presented to the public seemed almost impossible to challenge. Yet Jonathan had spent years negotiating billion-dollar acquisitions, and experience had taught him that stories appearing perfectly organized often concealed the most important omissions. He began reading every page again, this time paying attention not to what had been included, but to what had quietly disappeared. One detail immediately caught his attention. Every witness interviewed by investigators described Daniel Whitmore as a respected businessman with an impeccable reputation, but none of the reports explored his professional relationships beyond a brief corporate biography. Jonathan requested additional financial research on Whitmore's companies. Within hours, Michael returned carrying several newly obtained corporate records. While reviewing them together, they discovered a surprising pattern. During the previous 6 years, Whitmore had quietly dissolved multiple investment partnerships shortly before federal compliance reviews were scheduled. Each closure had been completely legal, yet the timing repeated itself with unusual consistency. Jonathan frowned. "Coincidences exist," he said quietly, "but successful people rarely repeat the same coincidence 6 times. Michael nodded but reminded him that unusual business decisions alone could not overturn a criminal prosecution. Jonathan agreed, yet his instincts continued pulling him toward questions no one else seemed interested in asking. Later that afternoon, Jonathan received permission to meet Amara privately inside the courthouse consultation room. She entered wearing the same charcoal coat, her expression calm despite another exhausting day of public scrutiny. She thanked him politely for his support but made no attempt to persuade him of her innocence. Instead, she asked why a man with everything to lose would continue standing beside someone the entire country had already condemned. Jonathan answered honestly, "Because every file tells me who people think you are, but nothing explains who you actually became." Amara looked down for a moment before quietly smiling. She explained that she had spent most of her nursing career believing every patient deserved compassion, even when circumstances were complicated. "People usually make decisions after hearing one side," she said softly. "Truth almost always arrives later." Her words settled deeply inside Jonathan's mind because they sounded less like a defense and more like a lesson learned through years of serving others. Before the meeting ended, Jonathan removed the photograph from the nonprofit clinic and placed it gently on the table. Amara glanced at it and immediately recognized the image from the community health fair. Jonathan pointed toward the braided leather bracelet around her wrist in the picture. "How long have you worn this?" he asked. She instinctively touched the bracelet she still wore beneath the sleeve of her coat and smiled with unexpected warmth. "Almost 8 years," she replied. "It was a thank you gift from an elderly patient who said kindness should always leave a mark you could carry." Jonathan stared silently at the bracelet as another faint memory flickered through his mind. Rain. Flashing ambulance lights. Pair of steady hands. A voice telling someone not to give up. The memory vanished before he could grasp it completely, leaving only an unsettling certainty that the bracelet belonged somewhere inside his own forgotten past. As Amara was escorted from the room, Jonathan realized he was no longer investigating only a courtroom accusation. He was following fragments of a story that seemed strangely connected to his own life, and for the first time he began to suspect that the evidence everyone trusted had been carefully arranged to prevent anyone from asking the one question that truly mattered. The consequences of Jonathan Hayes' decision spread through New York faster than any quarterly earnings report ever had. Before the markets closed that Friday afternoon, financial commentators were questioning his judgment on every major business network. Shareholders demanded emergency meetings, and opinion columns accused him of placing personal emotions above professional responsibility. Jonathan listened to none of it. From his office overlooking the Hudson River, he watched the winter sunlight fade behind rows of skyscrapers while another message appeared on his phone requesting that he immediately distance himself from Amara Brooks for the sake of his company's reputation. He quietly set the phone aside without replying. A few minutes later, Michael Carter entered carrying a folder marked confidential. His expression revealed that the pressure was no longer coming only from investors. Several influential business partners had postponed negotiations, 2 charitable foundations had suspended joint announcements, and one member of Jonathan's own board had privately suggested appointing an interim chief executive officer until the controversy ended. Jonathan absorbed every update without visible frustration. He had faced financial storms before, but this felt different. Someone wanted him to believe that supporting Amara carried consequences far beyond ordinary public criticism. Instead of retreating, that realization strengthened his determination. Later that evening, Jonathan attended an emergency board meeting inside the company's executive conference room. The atmosphere was unusually cold despite the polished elegance of the space. Around the long table sat directors who had trusted his leadership for years, yet now many avoided direct eye contact. One senior board member finally broke the silence, explaining that public confidence was falling and questioning why Jonathan continued defending a woman whose case appeared hopeless. Jonathan folded his hands calmly before answering. If our values disappear the moment they become expensive, then they were never values. They were only marketing. The room fell silent. Another director warned that the company could lose billions of dollars if the controversy continued. Jonathan simply nodded. Money can be rebuilt, he replied quietly. Integrity cannot. When the meeting ended, no resolution had been reached, but Jonathan understood that he had become increasingly isolated inside the very organization he had built. Walking alone through the nearly empty headquarters, he noticed the reflection of city lights across the glass walls and wondered how many people had already concluded he was making the worst decision of his life. Meanwhile, Michael continued investigating Daniel Whitmore's business network. Late that night, he called Jonathan with an unexpected discovery. Several employees who had once worked for Whitmore refused to speak on the record, yet every private conversation ended the same way. They all seemed frightened of discussing projects that had quietly disappeared years earlier. None would explain why. One former accountant abruptly ended the call after saying only one sentence. Mr. Whitmore always knew exactly which questions people should never ask. That sentence lingered in Jonathan's mind long after the conversation ended. The following morning, he visited the courthouse again before another hearing began. Amara was seated quietly in a consultation room reading a worn paperback novel borrowed from the courthouse library. She looked up as Jonathan entered and immediately noticed the fatigue in his face. You are paying a very high price for someone you barely know, she said gently. Jonathan smiled faintly. Perhaps, he answered. Or perhaps I am finally paying attention to something everyone else stopped noticing. Amara remained silent for a moment before thanking him, not for defending her publicly, but for treating her like a human being when so many others had already decided she no longer deserved that courtesy. As Jonathan prepared to leave, Michael rushed into the room carrying another file that had just arrived from an independent investigator. Inside was a forgotten insurance report connected to an incident that had occurred nearly 8 years earlier. Across the top of the first page was a location Jonathan recognized instantly, and before he even finished reading the opening paragraph, he felt the buried memory inside him begin to awaken with startling clarity. Jonathan carried the insurance report back to his office without speaking a single word. Long after sunset, the city outside his windows glittered with thousands of lights, yet his attention never left the faded document lying on his desk. The report described a multi-vehicle accident on a rain-soaked highway outside Albany almost 8 years earlier. Several travelers had received emergency medical attention before ambulances arrived, thanks to an off-duty nurse who happened to be driving home after a volunteer medical conference. The nurse's name had been partially redacted in the public copy, but one detail remained untouched. Witnesses described her as wearing a simple braided leather bracelet with a silver clasp. Jonathan closed his eyes as memories finally returned with startling clarity. He remembered the cold rain falling across shattered headlights, the distant sound of emergency sirens, and one calm voice refusing to let panic take control. He remembered struggling to stay conscious while someone repeatedly assured him that help was coming. He remembered looking down briefly and noticing a leather bracelet as gentle hands checked his pulse. Everything else had faded with time, but that single image had remained buried inside his memory until now. He immediately asked Michael Carter to locate the complete original report. By the following afternoon, Michael returned with documents obtained through legal channels. This time, nothing had been redacted. The attending off-duty nurse was Amara Brooks. Jonathan remained silent for several moments before slowly placing the papers back onto the table. 8 years earlier, before his company became one of the largest technology firms in America, before magazine covers and billion-dollar acquisitions transformed his life, Amara had helped save a complete stranger without asking for recognition or reward. She had never learned his name, and he had never learned hers. Their lives had separated that same evening, only to collide again under unimaginable circumstances years later. The realization changed something deep inside Jonathan. His determination was no longer driven only by instinct. It was strengthened by gratitude that had waited nearly a decade to find its rightful destination. Yet the investigation itself continued revealing troubling surprises. Michael uncovered financial correspondence showing that Daniel Whitmore had quietly funded several shell companies through intermediaries whose names never appeared in public records. None of the transactions were illegal on their own, but together they formed an unusually complex network that seemed designed to hide business relationships rather than investments. Jonathan hired independent forensic accountants to examine the documents more closely. Within days, they identified missing contracts, unexplained property transfers, and several corporate entities that had disappeared shortly before Whitmore's death. Every new discovery suggested that someone had invested enormous effort into controlling what investigators would eventually see. Later that week, Jonathan visited Amara again. She noticed a different expression on his face before he even spoke. He gently placed the restored insurance report on the table between them. As her eyes moved across the page, surprise slowly softened into quiet recognition. She smiled faintly. "I remember that night," she said. "There were several people waiting for ambulances. I stayed because anyone would have done the same." Jonathan shook his head gently. "Not everyone would have." Amara looked at him with genuine confusion as he explained that he had been one of the injured travelers she had helped all those years ago. Instead of reacting dramatically, she simply lowered her eyes and smiled with the same quiet humility that had impressed him from the beginning. "Then I am glad you recovered," she answered softly. "That is all that ever mattered." Jonathan realized in that moment that the woman sitting across from him had never measured kindness by recognition. She had walked away from one of the most important moments of his life without expecting gratitude, payment, or even remembrance. As he prepared to leave, Michael called with urgent news. An anonymous package had just arrived at their office containing copies of internal corporate emails linked to Daniel Whitmore's private companies. And one message hinted that someone inside the official investigation had known about the hidden financial network long before the case against Amara ever reached the courtroom. Jonathan and Michael spent the entire weekend examining the anonymous package inside a secure conference room far from the attention of reporters and investors. The envelope contained dozens of printed electronic messages, accounting summaries, and internal memoranda copied from Daniel Whitmore's private business network. At first glance, the documents appeared ordinary, but Jonathan quickly noticed that nearly every important conversation referred to projects using coded names instead of actual company titles. One phrase appeared repeatedly throughout the correspondence: "The foundation must remain protected." No document explained what the foundation actually was, yet every executive involved treated it as something far more valuable than any individual investment. Michael contacted independent forensic specialists who verified that the messages were authentic and had not been altered. Even more surprising, several emails had been exchanged only days before Daniel Whitmore's death, discussing an unexpected problem created by an honest witness who refuses to cooperate. No name appeared beside that description, but Jonathan felt an uneasy certainty growing stronger with every page he read. Meanwhile, the criminal case continued moving forward. Public opinion remained firmly against Amara, and television commentators repeated the same familiar arguments every evening. Jonathan no longer watched the broadcasts. Instead, he devoted every available hour to following evidence that no one else seemed willing to explore. His attorneys quietly requested additional discovery materials while private investigators began locating former employees connected to Whitmore's companies. Most declined interviews, but one retired administrative assistant finally agreed to meet after insisting the conversation remain confidential. They gathered inside a quiet coffee shop in northern New Jersey, where she nervously stirred her tea before speaking. She explained that Daniel Whitmore rarely handled sensitive matters personally. Instead, a small circle of trusted advisors managed confidential files and instructed employees never to ask unnecessary questions. Several years earlier, she had accidentally delivered documents to the wrong conference room and briefly overheard executives discussing how charitable organizations could be used to hide financial transactions without attracting attention. She never understood the details, but one sentence had remained in her memory: "If the nurse ever remembers what she saw, everything falls apart." Jonathan and Michael exchanged silent glances. Until that moment, they had assumed Amara became involved only shortly before her arrest. Now another possibility emerged. Perhaps she had unknowingly witnessed something years earlier without realizing its importance. Jonathan immediately arranged another meeting with Amara. Inside the courthouse consultation room, he carefully asked whether she had ever treated Daniel Whitmore before the investigation began. She thought quietly for several moments before slowly nodding. Years earlier, while volunteering at a free medical outreach event sponsored by several corporate donors, she had briefly met Whitmore after he complained of feeling unwell. The encounter lasted only a few minutes, but while waiting outside a temporary examination room, she remembered seeing several executives arguing over a stack of financial folders. At the time, she paid little attention because she was focused on caring for patients. Jonathan asked whether she recognized any faces besides Whitmore. Amara closed her eyes, searching distant memories until one image gradually returned. She described a silver lapel pin shaped like an eagle worn by one executive standing beside Whitmore. Michael immediately reached for his tablet and searched archived corporate photographs. Seconds later, he stopped scrolling and quietly turned the screen toward Jonathan. The same distinctive lapel pin appeared on the jacket of Richard Calloway, Whitmore's longtime chief financial officer, a man who had publicly cooperated with investigators since the beginning of the case. Jonathan felt the pieces beginning to align at last, but before anyone could speak another word, Michael's phone rang. After listening silently for several seconds, his expression changed completely. He looked directly at Jonathan and said in a steady voice, "The anonymous source just contacted us again. They say there is one witness still alive who knows exactly why Amara was chosen, and they are finally ready to tell the truth." The anonymous caller agreed to meet only once and only under one condition. There would be no reporters, no police officers, and no recording devices. Jonathan accepted immediately. The meeting was arranged for early Sunday morning inside a quiet chapel attached to a retirement community nearly 60 miles north of Manhattan. Snow covered the surrounding trees, and the peaceful silence stood in sharp contrast to the relentless media storm consuming New York. Jonathan arrived with Michael Carter just after sunrise. Sitting alone near the front pew was an elderly woman named Eleanor Pierce, a retired executive assistant who had worked beside Daniel Whitmore for more than 20 years. Her hands trembled slightly as she greeted them, not because of age alone but because she had carried the same burden for far too long. She explained that after Whitmore's death she had remained silent out of fear, believing no one would ever believe her. But after seeing Jonathan publicly stand beside Amara despite losing business partners and public support, she decided she could no longer keep the truth hidden. Eleanor slowly unfolded a worn envelope she had protected for years. Inside were handwritten notes, dated meeting schedules, and photocopies of correspondence she had secretly saved before retiring. She explained that several years earlier Whitmore's inner circle had discovered irregular financial transactions connected to charitable foundations and hidden investment accounts. The organization feared that a routine community health event might have exposed confidential documents when volunteers accidentally entered a restricted conference room. Most people who briefly passed through never noticed anything unusual, but one volunteer nurse paused long enough to glance toward an open table covered with financial records before being called away to assist a patient. That nurse was Amara Brooks. Eleanor emphasized that Amara never took documents, never asked questions, and almost certainly never understood what she had seen. Yet within weeks, private conversations inside Whitmore's office changed dramatically. Executives repeatedly referred to the nurse as an unpredictable risk because she could someday remember details investigators might overlook. Jonathan listened without interrupting. Every answer Eleanor provided explained another piece of the puzzle that had troubled him since the beginning. Amara had not been selected because she committed a crime. She had been selected because she represented uncertainty. Someone had concluded that if suspicion ever needed to be redirected away from hidden financial dealings, an ordinary volunteer with no political influence would become the easiest target. Eleanor then revealed something even more surprising. Richard Calloway had quietly coordinated internal document reviews immediately after that community health event, ordering employees to remove certain records from company archives. Several months later, many of those files officially disappeared during a corporate restructuring. Michael carefully organized every page Eleanor provided, knowing each document could become valuable supporting evidence if independently verified. Before leaving, Jonathan thanked Eleanor for her courage. She smiled sadly and replied, "The truth does not disappear because people ignore it. It only waits for someone willing to carry it." Those words remained with Jonathan throughout the drive back to Manhattan. By Monday morning, his legal team had already begun authenticating the newly discovered records, while independent accountants matched dates across financial reports obtained during previous weeks. The pattern became impossible to dismiss. Hidden transactions, disappearing companies, erased archives, and carefully redirected attention all pointed toward deliberate deception extending far beyond one courtroom. Yet as hope quietly returned for the first time, another challenge emerged. The judge announced that final evidentiary submissions would close within 48 hours. Any new material introduced after that deadline would almost certainly be excluded from consideration. Jonathan realized that despite everything they had uncovered, they still lacked one decisive piece capable of connecting every hidden thread into a single undeniable truth. Late that evening, Michael rushed into Jonathan's office carrying fresh laboratory verification confirming Eleanor's documents were authentic, but he also delivered one final message from the anonymous source. There was another sealed file hidden years earlier inside a private storage facility in Brooklyn, and according to the source, whatever remained inside that forgotten box would either save Amara forever or leave every unanswered question buried beyond anyone's reach. Before dawn on the morning of the court's final evidentiary deadline, Jonathan Hayes and Michael Carter stood outside an aging private storage facility tucked between old warehouse buildings in Brooklyn. Snow had melted into thin sheets of rain that reflected the yellow glow of streetlights across the empty pavement. The anonymous source had provided only one unit number and one access code before disappearing forever. Neither man knew whether they were about to uncover the missing truth or another carefully constructed distraction. The facility manager, following proper legal procedures, confirmed that the rental contract had expired years earlier after all outstanding fees had been paid anonymously. With official authorization secured by Jonathan's legal team, the steel door slowly rolled upward. Inside, there were no stacks of cash or dramatic secrets waiting in plain sight. Instead, the small unit contained several ordinary filing boxes, a locked metal briefcase, and a weathered banker box labeled simply with the year of the community health event where Amara had volunteered. Michael carefully photographed every item before opening them one by one. Most contained accounting records already familiar to the investigation, but hidden beneath old financial binders rested a sealed envelope addressed in Daniel Whitmore's own handwriting. Inside was a signed memorandum documenting a private meeting between Whitmore, Richard Calloway, and several senior advisors. The memorandum never mentioned Amara by name, but it repeatedly referred to the volunteer nurse and described concerns that an unexpected witness had entered the conference area during discussions involving confidential financial transfers. Attached to the memorandum was another document that changed everything. It was an internal instruction directing staff to reconstruct visitor timelines and preserve surveillance footage from that event. Yet beside the instruction, someone had handwritten a later note stating that the recordings had been removed because they created unnecessary future exposure. Jonathan immediately understood the significance. If surveillance footage had existed, then someone had intentionally decided it should disappear. They continued searching until Michael finally unlocked the metal briefcase. Inside rested several portable storage drives along with printed backup indexes. Digital forensic specialists working remotely through Jonathan's legal team began examining the contents immediately. Hours later, they called with astonishing news. Although many files had been deleted years earlier, fragments remained recoverable. Among those fragments was part of an archive security recording from the community health event. The recovered footage did not capture financial documents or secret meetings, but it clearly showed Amara entering the hallway carrying medical supplies before being called away by another volunteer only seconds later. She never approached the conference table, never handled any business records, and remained in the restricted area for less than half a minute. More importantly, the recording also showed Richard Calloway personally removing several folders immediately afterward while looking repeatedly toward the hallway. The recovered timeline directly contradicted statements he had given investigators, proving that he had concealed critical information from the very beginning. Jonathan immediately delivered every authenticated document, digital recovery report, and forensic certification to his attorneys. Throughout the afternoon, legal specialists worked tirelessly to organize the evidence into a clear chronological presentation before the filing deadline expired. Across Manhattan, news organizations continued predicting that Amara's conviction was inevitable because they knew nothing about the discoveries unfolding behind closed doors. Inside the courthouse, Amara remained remarkably composed despite believing that every remaining hour might determine the rest of her life. When Jonathan met her briefly before the afternoon hearing, he did not make impossible promises. Instead, he quietly placed the restored photograph from the community clinic beside the recovered memorandum and smiled with calm confidence. "You once told me that truth arrives later," he said softly. "Tomorrow, I believe it finally does." Amara looked at him with grateful eyes but answered only with a quiet nod. Neither of them noticed that, across the hallway, Richard Calloway had just spotted Jonathan's legal team carrying the newly recovered evidence into the courtroom. And for the first time since the investigation began, the confidence that had never left his face quietly disappeared. The courtroom remained unusually quiet as the final hearing began, as though everyone present sensed that something unexpected was about to unfold. Reporters filled every available seat, legal analysts prepared notebooks, and spectators watched Amara Brooks with the same curiosity that had followed her for weeks. She entered wearing the familiar charcoal coat and carried herself with the same quiet dignity that had never abandoned her despite every accusation. Jonathan Hayes took his place beside his legal team, looking calm even after weeks of relentless public criticism and financial pressure. When the judge invited final evidentiary submissions, Jonathan's attorneys presented the newly authenticated documents, the recovered corporate correspondence, the verified financial records, and the restored security footage obtained through independent forensic examination. One by one, each piece was carefully explained until a completely different picture emerged. The timeline originally accepted by investigators no longer matched the verified evidence. The recovered recording demonstrated that Amara had briefly entered the hallway only while responding to volunteer medical duties before immediately leaving again, never approaching confidential materials or participating in any private business discussions. The handwritten memorandum revealed that senior executives had privately identified an unnamed volunteer nurse as a potential future risk long before Daniel Whitmore's death. Financial experts then testified that hidden corporate transfers and disappearing partnerships formed a consistent pattern of concealment that had never been disclosed during the original investigation. Finally, Jonathan's legal team presented documentation showing that Richard Calloway had omitted critical information while cooperating with investigators, despite personally handling records connected to the missing surveillance files. The courtroom grew increasingly silent as every carefully verified detail reinforced the next. No dramatic speeches were necessary because the evidence spoke with quiet precision. After reviewing the newly admitted material, the judge ordered an immediate reassessment of the case. Prosecutors acknowledged that significant information had not been available during the original investigation and agreed that the existing accusations against Amara could no longer be supported under the new evidentiary record. Within hours, the charges against her were formally dismissed, and the court directed that further investigation focus on the concealed financial network uncovered during Jonathan's independent inquiry. For the first time since her arrest, Amara stepped outside the courthouse as a free woman. The crowd waiting across the plaza reacted differently than before. There were still cameras and questions, but the loud accusations had disappeared, replaced by thoughtful silence. Jonathan stood beside her once again, not to shield her from public judgment, but simply because respect no longer required explanation. A reporter finally asked why he had risked his reputation, his business relationships, and billions of dollars for someone he barely knew. Jonathan smiled gently before answering. Years ago, she saved a stranger without asking his name. She expected nothing in return. When I discovered that stranger was me, I realized gratitude delayed is still gratitude. But this was never only about repaying kindness. It was about refusing to let truth become less valuable than convenience. Amara quietly thanked every volunteer, investigator, attorney, and witness who had chosen honesty over fear, never speaking with bitterness toward those who had misjudged her. Several months later, Jonathan announced the creation of the Brooks Justice Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing legal resources, investigative support, and community advocacy for people facing wrongful accusations regardless of background or income. He invited Amara to become its first executive director. She accepted only after asking that the organization also include free health outreach programs because, in her words, communities became stronger when justice and compassion worked together instead of separately. On the first anniversary of the foundation, Jonathan visited one of its neighborhood centers without reporters or public announcements. Families received legal guidance, children attended after-school programs, nurses offered free health screenings, and volunteers welcomed every visitor with kindness. As Jonathan walked through the building, he noticed a young volunteer quietly helping an elderly man complete paperwork before offering him a warm cup of coffee with the same gentle patience Amara had once shown complete strangers. Jonathan smiled, understanding at last that the greatest legacy was never built through wealth alone. It was built each time one act of quiet compassion inspired another, proving that truth may arrive later than judgment, but when carried with courage and dignity, it still has the power to change countless lives.